Hello, everybody. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Martin Loffers. I'm the Chief Trend Watch of Supply Chain Media. I'm also the Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Movement, quarterly magazine and a website and LinkedIn group. And I'm also the architect of the IT supply map. It's all about supply chain applications, etc. Today, we have a live webinar on supply chain network design using location risk analysis. Very interesting topic. And in the next hour, we talk about it. And afterwards, we have some further time to have further discussions face to face. So that's me on the left-hand side. So next to me, I have Paul van Nierop. He is a product owner of supply chain within AIMMS. Welcome.
Thanks, Martin. Pleased to be here.
It's an interesting function now, product owner supply chain. So you own supply chain.
Own supply chain. Yeah, it would be nice to own the supply chain, but in fact, I own the software product that we build to help companies optimize their supply chain. So that's what it means.
Yeah. All right, we get back to your introduction of AIMMS. And last but not least, Daniel Martens. He's a climate risk intelligence lead at Royal Haskoning DHV, also connected with DISICON. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So later on, we have a quick introduction of both companies and what they're doing. So some household issues. This webinar will be recorded. The PDF will be made available afterwards within 48 hours. So the whole audience is on mute, but you have some opportunities to interact with us. So there are two ways. There is the chat on the right-hand side. So everybody can see an answer. So normally the first question will be, is this recorded? Yes, it is recorded. But please use the Q&A functionality, those two text clouds. I will track these questions. And if these questions are in line of the conversation we're having, I will ask this question right away. So you can have some interaction. And otherwise, I will reserve this question for the Q&A at the end. But next to this, after the whole hour, we have an extra 30 minutes in the virtual lounge. So basically, you can sit down with us and have a further conversation with Paul, Daniel, and myself. So right after this, I will put off my camera so you can enlarge the screen and then you can focus on the interesting slide. So I would suggest that Paul and Daniel will do the same. All right. An overview of the topics the CEOs are talking about during their quarterly earning calls. So basically, every quarter, the CEOs and CFOs of Fortune going wrong. I have to upload my screen again. Sorry for that. So like I said, in this overview, you will see what the CEOs are talking about. And to the right-hand side, you see a lot of talks about economic uncertainty, about AI. That's the new buzzword, even in the boardrooms. But also supply chain disruptions, layoffs, and also sustainability. So that's the overview of the Q2. And if you go to the Q3 overview, you will see that still talk about a lot about AI, sustainability, economic worries, and also about shortages in supply chain. And even to the right, to the left, you see reshoring also popping up. So to introduce both parties, first AIMMS. So Supply Chain Media has created an IT supply map. So basically, we have mapped out all the major supply chain vendors in Europe, ERP, WMS, TMS, etc. Also S&OP and network design. So if you look closely, you see AIMMS on the right-hand side. So AIMMS used to be a tool provider with operation research inside, but they developed themselves into an application vendor. Network design on one hand, that's the purple side, and the green one is more S&OP, forecasting and production scheduling. So that's the introduction. So Paul, but maybe you can say something yourself about AIMMS.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So AIMMS has been around for more than 30 years now. Started off in 1989 by a professor of Dutch applied mathematics from the University of Twente. And the original concept was to provide a platform, a low-code development platform for operations research people to build optimization models using mathematical optimization techniques. So that's a long time ago. Of course, as you said, things have changed a lot then. So that's still a cornerstone of our technology and what we provide. But over the last 6 years or so, we've been focusing on out-of-the-box functionality for supply chain, and particularly in network design, where we saw customers building a network design app over and over again. We said, let's be smart about that and build our own out-of-the-box technology. So very much still a global standard for operations research and mathematical modeling, but also now a global standard for supply chain network design software. And that's the technologies we'll focus on today in combination with the risk data, but we'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah.
So we're sorry, Martin.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Just in terms of where we are, we're headquartered in the Netherlands, in Haarlem, close to Amsterdam, but we also have customers certainly across the world, and also offices in North America and Asia Pacific in Singapore. And we really cover a large number of key markets, but principally food and beverage, manufacturing, consumer goods, etc. Two stats that I like a lot. One solve every 3 minutes. So somewhere around the world, someone's hitting the optimize button in an AIMMS application, which I think is very special. And also our customer satisfaction, what we get back from our customers, saying that's one of our differentiators, that we look after our customers really well.
So can you actually see when someone is hitting the optimization button?
It's mostly cloud deployed software, so yeah, we can count those clicks. Yeah. So certainly for all the cloud deployed applications.
It would be interesting to see, if you see the trends, if companies are clicking the optimize button more and more when something is happening. You maybe, when the disruption is taking place, you can see it happening that there's more clicking on the optimization button or something.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I think the cloud does bring some of those advantages. So we can see when people are using the applications more. We can even get to a point where we see which functionalities they're using and focus our development efforts there. So certainly, yeah, that's all become possible with the cloud deployment these days.
All right. So we're talking about supply chain network design this afternoon. So why is supply chain network design so important nowadays?
Yeah, it's important nowadays, and I think to some extent it always has been important, but it's been important at a more intermittent level than it is today. So just very briefly, just to sketch the context of what it is, we talk there about an approach to looking at the design of your locations, and that's about two things really: footprint, so the production and supply footprint. Where do I make my goods? Where do I buy them? And then the distribution footprint. How do I move product through my supply chain? How many DCs do I need? What mode of transport do I use, etc. And typically that's a really complex problem, but mathematical modeling is ideally suited to that. And it's also really heavily dependent on scenario planning, because these scenarios that you're planning for don't exist yet. So the ability to run multiple scenarios using a powerful mathematical solver is really key to that.
Yeah, and there's a quote from Gartner, so maybe you can tell me more about that.
Yeah, that's a little bit about what we touched on earlier. So 20 years ago, people were doing network design studies every 5 years, perhaps, or every 2 or 3 years, in some cases even less than that. And I think it's safe to say that the world was a little bit more stable than it is at the moment. But what we've seen happening lately is that need to redesign has become more pressing more often. So companies need to do the redesign more often, and it's not always about heavy capex decisions. It's also about disruptions in the supply chain, like things like a warehouse going down due to a tornado, or due to a COVID lockdown, or a ship gets stuck in the canal. So there you're not investing capex money to redesign, but you're shifting your network around what you've got. And I think that ability to do that on a regular basis, companies are seeing that need more and more.
Yeah, and what I also see, I do a lot of analysis about consulting and software applications. 5 to 10 years ago, it was quite normal to to go to the consulting firm and ask for a network design or network optimization study. But nowadays, companies are doing it more and more themselves because they have to do it more frequently. And maybe
Yeah.
you could get to the point. So here you see a lot of companies, and this reflects also that they have to do it themselves more and more often.
Yeah, exactly, and it's a very good point. So the concept of a network design center of excellence, I think, is a fairly recent, fairly recent over the last 5 years or so.
Yep.
Whereas previously it was network design was really the domain of network design consultants. Now
Yep.
you see a mix. So that hasn't disappeared. We still work with a large partner network where consultants are doing studies with AIMMS technology, but also companies establishing their own expertise in-house in a center of excellence.
Yeah, and you also see that consultancies are providing that as a service on a quarterly basis, and run it, and also with a tool like AIMMS run this kind of analysis, because you need some expertise on that, and some larger companies have it themselves. So what we see here is a wide range of both manufacturing companies, retail companies, and also logistic service providers.
Yeah, exactly. So supply chain network design sits at the strategic planning level. So the functionality is pretty generic. Of course, there's vertical specific problems, but if a company is making goods, physical goods, or moving physical goods, really they've got a physical supply chain network that needs to be optimized, that needs to be designed. So that's why the technology is quite generic, and it fits in a number of different verticals. There are the strengths in those verticals we mentioned earlier, but it is really quite a broad spread.
Yeah, and all of these companies mentioned here are multinational. So we talk about this global market and global network designs more and more. Okay, thank you, Paul. Daniel, could you explain a bit more about Royal Haskoning DHV, and also about Disticom?
Yeah. So Royal Haskoning DHV is an engineering consultancy with now more than 140 years old. Obviously, started primarily focusing on primarily civil engineering solutions, civil engineering design over the decades, particularly the last decades, I guess, through acquisitions and partnerships. And of course, as the company grew more into various sectors. So be it industry, water sector, maritime aviation, but also supply chains through their investment in Districon recently. So that has been an acquisition. So Districon is now part of the Royal Haskoning family, and adding their supply chain consultancy services, their expertise to the broader family. But in short, what we've done for decades, I don't want to say century, because obviously it has evolved, is really designing of logistics, production, and supply chain processes, physical infrastructure installations, and all the environmental services around that. And what we've seen primarily over the past decade or two, I guess, or three even, that transition to more operational needs, digital solutions, so the monitoring, analysis, and simulations of certain processes, be it in supply chains, be it in industrial processes, and on my end personally, in terms of climate and environmental processes.
Yeah.
So,
all right. You see a lot of large infrastructural designs, harbors, airports, etc. So that's a lot of your heritage, but also location analysis for warehouses, factories, etc. Thanks for your introduction, Paul. Maybe we talk about supply chain network design, but we also talk about risk. And in the title of this webinar, it's about location risk analysis. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about location risk analysis. So, and maybe just before we describe what that is, why is that a topic in supply chain and network design? So over the last 20 years, we've seen a real shift where previously network design was all about cost savings. So let me give the lowest cost network so that I can compete with my competitors. And to some extent, even service levels was less a feature. But that became a topic as time went by, to say, well, it's not just about low cost, but I need to have a good service level. Otherwise, I also don't compete very well. And then for a long time, cost and service level were the main KPIs or the main drivers of supply chain network design. But what we've seen lately, and that ties very much back to the slides you showed up front, Martijn, and what are CEOs thinking about? What are they talking about? And sustainability and risk have become the topics for certainly currently and for the next few years. So we also talk a lot with Gartner and what we're hearing from our customers, but also from industry experts, and it's backed by your slide earlier. Risk is one of the main topics that keeps people in the C-suite awake these days, and reasons around that are many. It's certainly a volatile world at the moment. Disruptions happen more and more frequently. Change is happening all the time. So there's risk, and I think COVID really brought the risk topic to the table, where a lot of supply chains were caught short. And companies are now saying, all right, let's redesign, but let's also use risk as a KPI.
Yeah, and we done a study, international study lately, quite recently, about reshoring, and you see a real shift because of the geopolitical turmoil in the world, I would say. But that's one side, the geopolitical shifts, I would say, but also weather and climate change. So Daniel, maybe you can explain a bit more about what the weather and climate.
Yeah, indeed. So obviously, well, first and foremost, taking a step back, this is not a lecture about climate change. It's more, we understand and acknowledge that there are a variety of risks, as you say, geopolitical, economic, societal, environmental. What we focus on is, as domain experts, we focus on, I guess, the climate risk that we can predict to a large extent, and that we feel we can prepare ourselves for. But there's a lot of confusion, obviously, because we have weather phenomena that occur on a daily basis around the world, such as, be it a typhoon here in Asia, where I reside, or tornadoes in the US, flood events, and so forth. And people tend to confuse that. I guess the media plays a little bit of a role in there with climate directly. However, just to distinguish those two, when we talk about weather, we generally refer to the shorter term changes in the atmosphere, whereas climate really refers to the longer term changes. And obviously they're correlated, because as we see today, increases in temperature that have been going on over the past century or so are indeed resulting in new or more severe weather events here and there.
Yeah. So if you have a closer look to the impact of climate change and the weather as a whole, you see all kind of things happening, impacting the supply chain. Here you see some examples.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
indeed.
Yep. So what do you?
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think this is just to illustrate a variety of concepts or consequences that most of you will be familiar with. We all know about wildfires. Many of you know about floods and the direct impacts thereof. What we find is often misunderstood is primarily the indirect consequences, right? The consequences, well, let's say from a supply chain perspective, upstream, maybe your supply chain that may cascade through that supply chain. Of course, we don't only look at supply chain, we look at broader systems as well. Well, we all know the evergreen example, but take heat stress. That's often overlooked, but as part of some of the aspects that we need to take into account. How will that affect our productivity in the future? In case anything needs to be built, what I personally like is the center picture, right, where you see the railway. This is something that I guess many people don't know or are not aware of, but due to the increase in temperatures, and particularly over prolonged periods during heat waves, such as we had in 2022 in, well, most parts of the world, materials, right, that our infrastructure are made of tend to be affected as well. So what you see here is buckling of railways, right? And that could, of course, severely disrupt rail transport.
Yeah, and even heated tarmac. It is not only railways, but even the highways can and will be affected.
Indeed, and airports. So seemingly there are thresholds for airplanes even to lift or basically to use the airways for landing and taking off.
Yeah, in the long run, nowadays, I read the last week or 2 weeks ago, that the Panama Canal is being affected by the drought. So that could be also a major impact for the supply chains around Central America.
And and we've seen it. I'm not sure. I'm assuming many are familiar with what happened last year, the River Rhine in Europe, but
Yep.
even the major river in China, the Yangtze, they were nearly dried up, and it affected shipping traffic and all the industries along the rivers.
Yeah, right. If you have a close look to what kind of weather effects you have, and here's a whole summary of all kind of effects. How do you interpret this all this impacts?
Yeah, so it's we what we notice is in well, at least in my experience, what we notice is that it can be quite overwhelming. So supply chain leaders today, they have a lot on their hands already, right? They have a lot to deal with, and I guess their primary focus is business continuity. So
Hmm.
then come the climate. Well, I don't want to say activists, but the climate specialists, let's say, talking about the need to take into account climate risks.
Hmm.
But obviously, it can be quite overwhelming particularly if you're not a domain expert. And this is actually just to illustrate the multitude of aspects that basically climate and natural hazards comprise. So generally, when we talk about climate, we think about floods, storms, typhoons, maybe drought, but there's so much to it. Natural hazards such as earthquakes, tsunamis, of course, land subsidence, landslides, and even just general changes in temperature can affect us. So what we're trying to say is it is quite complex, and I'll show that later on as well. What we try to do, we try to simplify it for the end user. We want to take away that burden on the supply chain leaders and other decision makers, so they don't have to worry about these risks, but we can, help you with that, creating insights.
But it's also good to see with this kind of overview that it's interconnected. Drought and wildfires. But this summarizes the system dynamics of climate, I would say, and it gives a more or a better grasp, I would say. If you go to your line of work, how does it work? How do you go forward if you talk about climate risk and resilience?
Yeah. So what we generally start with, we have a framework
Yep.
where we start by first, depending on our client or our partner's awareness, right, or understanding of the impacts, we first should focus on creating insights, awareness, and understanding of the various types of risks that are at play. So what you see here is a division between physical risks and transition risks. So the physical risks are then subdivided into the acute risks that we are most familiar with, such as storms, floods, heat waves, and the chronic risks, as we call them. So those are the longer-term climatic changes or the consequences thereof, such as sea level rise. And then transitions risks are a bit, well, I don't want to say more abstract, but those are the ones that really focus on changes in due to economy, reputation, market developments, and so forth. All these together can have various types of impacts. Direct impacts due to, let's say, physical damage to assets, but more so disruptions or indirect impacts on operations, on supply chains, and even on general productivity. So what we then do is we globally, not just us in RSGG, but in organizations globally, we tend to focus on, okay, we say, how can we better prepare ourselves to become more resilient against these risks? What we see is that the majority of organizations, they are very much pushed, I guess, to focus on mitigating their impact on the environment, and rightfully so, because we are all, part of this big world, and that's really focusing on setting net zero targets, reducing our carbon emissions, and so forth. What's often left out, however, is the parts, and that what I just said, we call that mitigation.
Mhm.
But what's often forgotten or less focused on is the adaptation side of climate resilience. And that's where we really focus on, okay, how can we make ourselves more resilient to future changes? In this particular case, climate-related changes. And what you see there is there are various frameworks that we use, that we can use to guide us through that. And all in all, adaptation and mitigation should eventually lead, if we tackle that early on, and that's the primary difference compared to, I guess, decades ago where we built infrastructure for the 50 years ahead. And as Paul also mentioned, and you, Martijn, as well, that we, let's say, we try to update certain revisions less frequently. Now the needs and the changes are much more frequent. So we try to come up with strategies to make our businesses more resilient through adaptation and mitigation. Yeah.
So you get more opportunities out of that.
Indeed. Yeah.
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 And
indeed.
All right.
That should reduce the big impact. Indeed. Yeah.
Paul, a question to you. If you look at this framework, you are mainly working in a network design in the adaptation environment, but there's a whole world before all that. This is also give you new insights to look at a different way at what you're doing in network design?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's also, maybe just to build on what Daniel was saying there in terms of the adaptation and mitigation, I think there's a role for both there in network design. So if you look at our technology from a mitigation point of view, we've got a lot of customers actively modeling carbon emissions in their supply chains right now to say, okay, well, how do we redesign our supply chain to find a trade-off between lowering carbon and still maintaining our cost position or our competitive service position. So there's a lot of work that can be done from a design point of view in mitigation. So design your supply chain to lower the carbon, because a lot of that carbon emissions is structurally embedded in the supply chain design. But then also recognizing that there's an adaptation factor, and that you can start doing something about it. And I think that's the big connection between the work that Royal Haskoning and Daniel do in terms of identifying the risk. Our job then in network design is to say, all right, so what do we do about it? So what's the impact of that? Why does it matter, and how do we get around it? So that's really where these two worlds come together.
And if I look at the potential business impacts, traditionally when you look at network design, you do cost optimization. You have this balancing of your cost, and that's it. But if you look at the several potential business impacts, like regulatory, but also change in demand, but also strikes, that kind of stuff, this gives a total different new angle of you have to be aware that some point could be out of business for some time, whatever certain reason.
Yeah.
So it gives a broader perspective on the whole supply chain optimization era.
Yeah, exactly. So it brings in all those different elements, and it's also worth mentioning as well that the risks. So we're using climate risk here as an example.
Yeah.
But risk can also be geopolitical risks. They can they can have a number of different sources. So we're using climate risk here as an example, but it certainly allows the supply chain network designer to say, okay, well, let me take these things into account. And I really like the split there between chronic and acute, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So the chronic effects 10, 20 years from now, that's very much a strategic design question.
Yeah.
The acute risks, if your warehouse, your production gets knocked out by a tornado, that's pretty acute. But you can also use network design, as we said earlier, to come up with a contingency plan around that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later as well.
Yeah. Daniel, can you guide us through an example of a quick scan?
Yeah, sure. So what we do, we basically maintain a database of global hazards, natural hazards, comprising all the hazards you saw previously on one of the previous slides. And that basically allows us to, for any location in this world, make visible what a climate risk would be for that particular location. So in this quick scan, what we generally do is we, as clients ask, as they are interested in getting a quick overview of, hey, what are my key risks, or give me a sense of, hey, what's happening in my network, so to say, or with my assets. What we do is we just map them out very quickly in this particular quick scan. Then we identify the top locations at their risk. What you see is some numbers there. Of course, those numbers are indices that are accumulated. We'll, of course, provide an explanation on that. And then give you a quick snapshot for decision making. Say, okay, now I can clearly see that out of all my locations, these top 3 are risk, and I should probably prioritize my attention to that, and maybe have a deeper look at them. But we can also look at all these locations, of course, in more detail. As you see here, it's just an example of a quick scan where we then map out the various locations against a variety of hazards. Here we've done it for 3. We have more than 16 in our database, and for each we would provide an explanation. Now, that's what we call a quick scan, but we can also do a portfolio-wide scan, where we really have a dashboard such as you see here. Our users can just browse through that. They can upload their data and kind of get a sense of, okay, wow, I can clearly see which of my locations are at risk. And those could be, our clients' own assets, or it could be suppliers, nodes, competitors, even, you name it.
And what we've seen at the tsunami in 2011, the automotive was hit, I think, at the tier 2 because they all had the same supplier from a certain part necessary for the engine. If you map this out also upstream, then you will see that you get a high risk because you are all depending on the same tier 2 supplier in a certain area.
Yes, indeed. I presume I'm based in Singapore, so I presume we were not the only ones affected by the microchip shortages last year.
No,
Probably still ongoing. Yeah.
And what does it result to, this portfolio scan?
So then, as you saw, you could do it for a portfolio-wide assessment, but we can also show these details. So you could basically view for each of these assets which, more details, so which hazard really impacts my specific asset the most. So what you see here, it says consecutive dry days. That's actually more of a, I won't say scientific, but more on a engineering word for drought. In this particular location in Africa is kind of a key risk factor for that location. Generally, what we do is we advise the client and we say, okay, well, let's look at the top 3 or 4, depending on the severity, and see if your assets are resilient enough from a physical perspective, but maybe also from an operational perspective.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, Paul, maybe you can talk about, there are 2 worlds, the one of this Royal Haskoning DHV, about this kind of assessment, and your network design environment. Maybe you can talk about it, how to relate these 2 worlds.
Yeah, it's those 2 worlds that you talk about, and for us it was really exciting to start on this collaboration, because as you see on this picture on the right over there, you've got Royal Haskoning, who's got access to this really rich data and information on the risk exposure of your locations. And if you look at the maps, those dots on the map on the right hand side, that could very well be the dots on the map in your supply chain network design. So we very quickly connected the dots to say, all right, so now you know the exposure of all your locations in your supply chain, but so what do you do about it? Yeah. And that's really where the complementary strength of AIMMS comes into the picture. So what you can do is you can then start understanding the risk exposure, but also the impact. So let me just talk a little bit about the way it works first, and then we'll talk a little bit about how that's used in action. But what we do is we take those risk indexes from Royal Haskoning. So we start with the supply chain. Let's start on the left with the supply chain, where you've got all your suppliers, all your production facilities, all your warehouses, and your customers mapped out. And then you classify those as key assets or key locations in your supply chain. So maybe it's the customers that give you 80% of your demand, plus all your production facilities, plus all your tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, and all your warehouses. And then we get the exposure, the risk exposure for each of those locations from the Royal Haskoning data. And we introduce that into the supply chain network design model as a custom objective, essentially. And then what we can do is we've got the risk indexes built in as a data point in the model, just as it is alongside freight costs and alongside carbon emission factors. And now we can start working with that. And what we do is we run an on-off scenario for each location. So we basically switch it off and we rerun the optimization and said, if something happened to this location, what would be the impact? And impact is measured different ways. So in the rest of the talk, we'll focus on profit as an impact, but it could be an impact on your service levels or an impact on your carbon emissions, on any KPI that you're measuring in your design. But for each of those, so we run a batch of a couple of hundred or more or less scenarios, depending how complex the supply chain is. But run this batch of scenarios where you just make a location unavailable, so to some extent actually decoupling from the risk. But when it's closed, what is the impact on my profit? How much profit will I lose if that facility is no longer available to me? And if you've done that for every single location in your supply chain, you've got this beautiful set of data where you've got the exposure to risk, but also the impact to risk if something happens to that location.
So how long does it take to run this the scenarios?
Well, I mean, it's optimization technology, so an individual run it can be really quick in a matter of minutes, depending on the complexity of the supply chain. But if you're doing hundreds, you can do them in a sequence. So you may take you a few hours or an overnight. We can also do that in parallel if we need to. So we're not talking about weeks and months here. We're talking about hours perhaps.
Okay. Okay, let's talk about how do you optimize, because I get some questions from that angle, but maybe you can say something about what was the usual way to optimize your network and what is the new way.
Yeah, so the concept of multiple objectives becomes very important. So the optimization itself is done through a mixed integer linear program. It's a MIP formulation, so there's no black magic there. But the question is, what is your objective that you're optimizing for? So essentially the way it works is you give an objective, you say maximize profit or minimize risk or minimize carbon, and do that subject to a number of constraints. So basically the business rules and the constraints that are in the supply chain are worked into the model as constraints. And then the variables are the unknowns. So when you hit the optimize button, what you get back is essentially a recommendation or recommended action, because it tells you in this scenario to maximize or minimize this objective subject to these constraints. This is how much you should make. This is how much you should buy. This is how much you should move. This is the throughput at each warehouse. This is the allocation of every customer to a servicing location. So that's a little bit, I'm not sure if that was the question, but that's a little bit about the mechanics of how we optimize in the technology.
Well, yeah. The question what I get, would lowering carbon emissions provide the same optimization as lowering transportation miles, or do other items influence carbon emissions?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. So I think if you, and in most cases, lowering the miles will lower the carbon emissions. So if things are working well, you can get lower cost for and lower carbon emissions. And I think in the example of transport miles, that's usually the case. I think what's important though is the structure of the end-to-end network also plays a role there. So if structurally you've got your DC located very far away from your customers, you may be able to make incremental improvements in the number of miles and hence incremental improvements in the carbon emissions. But if you relocate your DC to be in the middle of your customers, that's a structural shift that gives you a benefit on both. So I think there's cases where they go in the same direction, but also in a lot of cases it's a matter of trade-offs. So it's about how how much are you willing to spend in order to reduce carbon emissions? And that's the ability to make those trade-offs that becomes really important with the technology like the supply chain navigator.
Yeah, but I also think, it's not a snapshot of what you should optimize, but also take a longer picture for a month or a quarter. It's also a matter of the frequency of your transportation, and if you do, a transportation in bulk by rail. So I think that supply chain network design used to be a snapshot and an optimization, but nowadays you take a longer range, a month or a quarter, and then you look at what's happening, and then you get different outcomes. I would expect.
Yeah, I think so, and it all depends on what you're trying to do. But maybe one very good example of the trade-off and the time buckets that we're talking about here. One of our customers is actively exploring the trade-off between costs, service level, and carbon. And the trade-off there is between air freight and sea freight. So if you air freight, you've got a very high carbon emission, or relative per unit shipped, a very high carbon emission and a high cost, but a very good service level and a low working capital. But if you sea freight, you've got maybe on a per unit, I know there's a lot of debate about this, but on a per unit basis, you're probably emitting less carbon because you can ship much bigger volumes. But you need to keep extra safety stock because of the lead time. So your working capital goes up. So these trade-offs, they often pull in different directions. This ability to find the sweet spot between these different objectives, I think that's the real trick and the real interesting thing.
Yeah. Before we go to the next topic of business continuity planning, I was wondering, Daniel, this is the optimization world, whereas you have a portfolio analysis of all kind of risk, climate risk. How do you look at this optimization field? Because that's a different field from your angle, I think.
Yes, indeed. That's a very good question, Martijn. So for me, it makes it really, I say, more tangible. Because what we often tend to look at when we talk about, I guess, these risks and climate risks, as Paul mentioned earlier as well, we tend to look at longer time ranges. And I feel that these optimization needs really, for me, make it kind of clearly shows, okay, so how does this affect supply chains directly, and particularly on a shorter term basis, because I understand that there are operational needs. Again, taking Singapore as an example, I don't know about the audience here, but I'm incredibly used to very fast deliveries, let me put it like that, of anything that I would order, so to say, or anything is within reach from where I'm located. And I can really sense that impact should there be anything happening around the world, be it a heat wave in China, be it I guess the shutdown of ports in China due to COVID restrictions, be it geopolitical situations everywhere. So for me, it just makes it very tangible. I hope it answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, if you look at the business continuity planning, okay, you mentioned that you run all the scenarios and take a point in your network, and so what is the effect of it, and what do you do with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what you've got suddenly with this data combined with the technologies, that you can start becoming a lot more proactive about your planning. And I think what we spoke about previously was pure strategic network design, and that maybe ties in a little bit with the long-term effects, and in this example again of climate change. So you might consider relocating a production facility because 20 years from now it's going to be under sea level. So that's a strategic decision that you can make. But in the shorter term, there's also tactical decisions you can make. And if something happens, what do you do about it? And I think that's the beauty of the mathematical optimization, because it's a prescriptive analytics. So it gives you back a recommended action. So if you look over there on the map, for example, the map on the right has got a location in the middle of France, and that's servicing a lot of customers. Now, if you run a scenario where you switch that CDC in Paris off, and you say, well, something happened there. We don't know what it was. We don't know if it was a strike, a tornado, an earthquake, or whatever it may be. But if something happens there, firstly, what's the impact? So how much money will we lose? How many customers will we not be able to serve? how much extra tons of carbon we also put into the atmosphere. But what's the plan B? So the map on the left is plan B. So you shift some of your customers to the Brussels DC, you shift some of your customers to the DC bottom right. I can't see exactly the name. And you've got a few extra customers that are serviced over longer distances, for example, so there'll be impact on transport costs. But so for every location, you can be very proactive and say, let's just run a scenario before trouble hits. Let's run a scenario and see what the impact is. And if the impact's really tiny, we don't worry so much. But if the impact's really big, maybe we can start thinking about how we mitigate that. But we also got a recommendation of how we deal with it. What's the plan B? So I think we also see customers taking a much more proactive view of the world rather than just reacting to the disruption after it's happened, but to say, okay, let's be smart and do some work beforehand so that if something happens, doesn't matter what, we know what to do.
Yeah, and if you go back to the slide of Daniel has shown, with the drought of the Rhine River, and it makes some particular flooding. We had some flooding in Slovenia last summer, and you name it. If you take all this kind of climate effects into account, you can already have an overview. I can imagine that the Rhine will be lower in some time in the near future, so you have a better focus what kind of scenarios you have to pre-run in the sense you're mentioning, Paul.
Yeah, and I think exactly that. So you can look at what happened in the past, but of course we're also worried about what will happen in the future, and often we can see that coming, but often we can't. And I think that's why I really like the whole location risk analysis concept, because it highlights the locations and the modes of transport that you should be really worried about, and we can see some of that in the slides that follow.
Yeah, but Paul, I think you mentioned that companies can be better prepared to take a node in the network, and for what kind of reasons, whatever. But when they look at the news and see things coming, they will recognize, okay, now we have to put scenario 25 into place. I say something like that because the Rhine has been lowered, etc. So I can imagine they categorize all the scenarios and they know when the shit hits the fan, which scenario to take into place.
Yeah. So you can already be prepared for that, exactly. So I think that's the concept of being proactive rather than reactive. Of course, you can still be reactive.
Yeah.
So we've also seen customers when something unexpected does happen, like a DC shutdown, they get into a boardroom and they run the scenarios and they say, okay, well, we need to shift some volume. Let's call up that other DC and ask them to add an extra shift. These customers we're not going to be able to service. Let's call them up. Let's understand from a budget point of view, it's going to cost us X amount of dollars extra for the next 3 months. So you can be reactive, but I think a lot of companies would much more be proactive and do it ahead of time.
Yeah, right. So if you talk about overall risk, how does that look like?
Yeah, so this is a summary of the output of the whole location risk and analysis exercise. So what you see on the bottom axis is the total risk, and this is the data that's provided by Royal Haskoning. So for every dot on the map is an asset in our supply chain, either a customer, a supplier, a warehouse, or a production. And on the x-axis, we're plotting the risk. So what's the exposure to that risk, that climate risk that Daniel spoke about, and that data that we get from Royal Haskoning. And then up on the y-axis is the impact. So what's the profit loss if each of those locations had to get, if something had to happen to one of those locations. So on this quadrant chart, let's call it a quadrant chart, you're mapping out those two elements of risk. What's the exposure? That's the x-axis. And what's the impact? That's the y-axis. And that combination of risk and impact is typically what risk managers use to say, okay, well, where do we focus our attention? And if you interpret this chart, it means basically the following. Those two dots on the top right,
yep,
those are assets that are highly exposed to risk. And if something happens there, you're in really big trouble. You're going to lose a lot of money. Now, the dots on the bottom left of the chart, those are less exposed to risk, so probably nothing's going to happen. And even if something does happen, it's not such a big deal. You're not going to lose that much money. So I think this is really powerful in terms of focusing the attention on where should I put my efforts and my energy and my capital a lot of times to mitigate the risk in my supply chain. Let me worry about those top right ones a lot more than I worry about the bottom left ones.
I was wondering, Daniel, when you look at this slide, I can imagine you have other scenarios, but now it's translated in profit loss. Does it give you another view on this topic?
Yeah, yes, indeed. Because generally, how we traditionally look at it is really on a basically from a physical damage perspective. So, for example, when we do studies for governments, let's say for the public sector, um, that's where governments, they tend to look at, okay, what is the potential impact on certain buildings if an event, let's say a flood event, occurs at a certain point of time, and there's all kinds of economics behind the value of those assets. Um, but now changing that to profit, of course, for me, is kind of a direct translation to kind of private sector needs, more supply chain related needs. So I do see some similarity, but at the same time, as I said just now, it makes it a bit more immediate, the need.
Yeah, and Paul, when you look at that, well, in this example, the Jeddah and Riyadh locations, you have to worry about it, and then you have to take some measurements or some precautions to tackle these risks. What are the options in this case?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends highly on the supply chain. So I would say this is just an example. But if you look at the one is an LDC and the other one is a demand point.
Yep.
So depending on what kind of asset is as well, there'll be different strategies, right? So I mean, you don't want to do a lot with your biggest customers, but you could argue that a DC location that's at high risk, you could look at alternative locations for that.
Yeah.
Suppliers that are really high risk, you could look at multi-sourcing options. So you don't necessarily need to change the supplier completely, but you could look at some multi-sourcing options there. Production facilities, you may create some spare capacity as a capacity buffer somewhere else, just in case. I think there's different strategies depending on what the supply chain is, and depending on how imminent the risk is, I guess, and the amount of capex available.
Yeah, but it's good to know that when you see this kind of risk exposure, that you brainstorm all your alternatives and your course of actions in case it happens.
Yeah.
So this is the snapshot for this company and their locations in 2023. So this year. So how would it look like in 2045?
Yeah, that was a real eye opener for me when we started the collaboration with Royal Haskoning as well. So I must say I also was in the trap of assuming weather was climate. So it's great that Daniel put up that slide earlier, and where maybe the previous slide talks more about this year and things that we see happening like heat waves and hurricanes. But 20 years from now, 22 years from now in this example, things will have changed a lot, and things that we don't see coming necessarily may have happened. So the long-term effects, the chronic effects that Daniel spoke about. So sea level rise, where some locations will just disappear. Long-term changes in temperature, where airports that function perfectly well now won't in the future. So this is, I think it's important to go also back to the long-term adaptation in the supply chain. So you really need to be taking, again, a strategic long-term view 20 years out to say, okay, I'm all right for now, but I need to start thinking about what these risks will do 20 years from now and designing for that as well. I think that's just to illustrate the point. There's a long-term scenario here and there's a short-term scenario, and both are important.
Yeah, and look at long term. I had a presentation 10 years ago about what might happen in southern East China with the probable drought that could inflict the industrial area a lot. So what's your take on that, Daniel? Because the drought will I'm afraid it will happening in certain areas that has an effect on certain industrial areas.
Yeah, indeed. So, well, in my recollection, I do not recall droughts occurring so often. what we do see is, and of course, let's not go into the scientific debates on climate change and so forth, but we do see trends that are moving in the direction of temperatures rising. That seems to be very evident across the world. There are, of course, what we call these macro scale climate effects. Then there's the regional effects such as El Nino, La Nina, which affect temperatures over, let's say, a multi-year period, such as we are in now. But what we generally see is indeed an increase in temperatures. That's almost, well, that's kind of factual. Increase in temperatures indeed leads to drought becoming more prominent, and not just more prominent in regions where that are already arid, but also in regions that are traditionally are not so arid. You see that in Northern Europe, but we also see that in the Southern Hemisphere. And then, of course, it's compounding, because then you have, with increases in temperatures, you have increases in certain weather events such as typhoons, cyclones, and so forth.
Yeah, right. So what we did last year, because McKinsey was writing about business ecosystem and Gartner was writing about supply chain ecosystems a month later, and I tried to Google for pictures on ecosystem, and I didn't get anything useful. So basically what we did last year in the fall, we created an ecosystem visualization of household products. And basically what this visual is saying is that, it's no longer a linear supply chain from raw material to manufacturing to end product and usage. It's like looking like this. It's like, like SimCity of the late 90s. It's like all kind of entities are in your supply chain network. And from the upper left, you have your raw materials, and in the middle, you have your manufacturer, and downstream, lower right, you have your customers, different segments, etc. But basically, what I want to visualize with this overview of an ecosystem, you have also third-party involvement like NGOs, banks, governments, etc. And in the brown area, you have your logistics service providers, but even recycling companies. So it's becoming circular. And in the green area, you have the green energy providers, organic material suppliers. So basically, what I suggest to a lot of companies, visualize your whole ecosystem, because this will all will change. And getting back to AIMMS and the network design, you have to visualize your ecosystem, because there are different parties involved. And as you see here, there are flow of goods, flow of information, also legislation, information flow. So basically, visualize your ecosystem. Will get a better overview what's happening in your industry, but also you have adjacent ecosystems also taking use of the same capacity and sources. So basically that's what I suggest, that companies to visualize their own ecosystem, not their own company and their own network, but in the broader sense. So Paul, what's your reflection on this kind of visualization?
Yeah, I really like it, Martin. It's also a big topic, right? So if you look at what we spoke about, mitigation and adaptation, I think of both, and I think the circular economy is one of those things we need to get busy with in terms of mitigation. So I really like it.
And Daniel, how do you look at this kind of visualization of an ecosystem in a business sense?
Yeah, so, well, first and foremost, commend you on your visualization skills. I really like this. Second, for me, what it really shows, as you say, that interconnectedness, that connectivity, and that's what we see generally as well. So when we talk in the climate sciences, we're already talking, and we see governments talking about cascading effects, because everything is so interconnected. So should anything, for me, the way I look at it is, should anything happen, let's say anywhere in this diagram, there's a large likelihood that it may impact a number of the other, I guess, how you call that, dependencies, I would say.
All right. So we're almost out of time for the actual webinar itself. So we have 1 minute left for questions. So I don't know if there are any urgent questions right now, because we also have an extra 30 minutes in the virtual lounge for another round of questions. So I would suggest, if there are any questions, come over to the virtual lounge and ask these questions directly to Paul, Daniel, or me. So that's my suggestion, because then we can keep it within the hour. So basically, right after this, we have an extra 30 minutes. So Daniel, Paul, and myself will be sitting in the virtual lounge. Looks like this. And click on table number 1. And a Zoom kind of meeting will pop up, and you can directly ask questions to the 3 of us. So that's what I suggest. There's further information. You can download this ecosystem. In the middle, there's an interesting blog written by a colleague of Daniel, Jack Paul, about resilient supply chain and how to get there. And together with AIMMS, we created a checklist for network design tooling. So how to get to the right question, what do you need? So that's for further information. And even more, there's way more information by AIMMS. So that's all here. And with this, I would like to thank Daniel for your participation. A real eye-opener for me.
Thank you for inviting.
All right, and Paul. Then again, network design is an important topic, and thank you for your explanation, and giving some real context of these two worlds combining.
Thank you, Martin. Always a pleasure.
And the audience, thank you for listening in, live or in the recorded version. I hope you like it. Again, this has been recorded, and the PDF will be made available within 48 hours. So thanks again. I hope to see you at another webinar Wednesday, or I hope to see you in the lounge. So thanks for now, and I hope to see you later in the lounge or next week. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you.